Who was pointing out these errors to Mr. Cox and Haller Nutt's absence? The criticism must have come from an enslaved person with decades of experience in managing a plantation, someone like Frederick, who had been brought to the place to improve conditions and who had successfully earned the trust of Haller Nutt. In fact, assuming Frederick was the one who alerted the overseer to the mishandling on the plantation wouldn't be too great a stretch. His punishment for doing so was a severe whipping. The following year, it was necessary to address issues involving flooding and drainage. Frederick and a force of between 30 and 25 enslaved laborers worked to strengthen the main levee and dig ditches around the side levees. In 1846, Nutt sold Laurel Hill and transferred all his enslaved laborers and capital permanently to Araby. By Christmas 1847, there were 25 cabins in the quarters for the enslaved at Araby Plantation. The cabins were divided in half with a family or group living on each side. Frederick, his wife Maria, and their 5 children lived on one side of the 8th cabin. The mention of 5 children in Frederick's household indicates that his wife had given birth after coming to the plantation. These accommodations, though typical of housing throughout the South, were far from ideal. Nutt himself acknowledged this when he wrote of the enslaved laborers. "I think their sickness, owing to working all day without rest and then sleeping in crowded, dirty apartments." Life at Araby for Frederick, his family, and his friends was characterized by cruelty, brutal living conditions, and relentless toil. Running away provided members of the enslaved community with a brief respite. Running away from the plantation was an act of defiance, one of the best tools of resistance available for the enslaved at Araby. Unfortunately, the price paid for leaving was high. In March 1843, the overseer waxed poetic about a rare snowfall. He described it as remarkable and beautifully clear, yet nothing at Araby Plantation existed without the constant reminder of the brutal and horrific reality of chattel slavery. The overseer declared it a fine time to follow tracks in the woods. When he spoke of tracks, he did not mean deer or rabbit or bear, of which there were plenty at that time. He meant the footprints of human beings. Animals were not the only things being hunted in that woods. The overseer called out the hounds and tracked an enslaved man who had run away. He noted that he found him by his tracks in the snow. Having some of the enslaved workforce absent seemed to be the norm at Araby. In May 1843, 5 enslaved laborers were absent in the woods. Some even managed to leave for an extended period of time, though their access to food and clothing suffered in the interim. Patrick left the plantation in September and came home of his own accord in December, nearly naked. Dick returned a few days after he had run away. He was brought in by his wife. Nutt chose not to whip him, but chained him to Jerry, another runaway, as his punishment. The following day, still in chains, Dick and Jerry escaped together. In 1848, another overseer, yet another overseer, went to get Frank out of the Port Gibson jail. The advertisement that ran in the newspaper to alert Frank's enslaver about his apprehension as a runaway noted that he was around 40 years old and had the marks of having been considerably whipped. The cruelty inflicted upon members of the enslaved community at Araby and later winter quarters was not just at the hands of the overseer. Haller Nutt had a reputation amongst the enslaved for being a brutal master. Isaac Throgmorton, who had escaped slavery in 1853, was interviewed several years later by the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission. He said, "Mr. Nutt, who lived in Louisiana, was very cruel indeed. When Nutt raped an enslaved woman on his plantation, the woman's husband objected and was saucy toward Nutt. Nutt had the man tied up by his thumbs and whipped awful. The next morning, he was a dead man." Enslaved women on the plantation were Nutt's property. Frederick's wife, Maria, and his daughters were considered property, and as such, they did not have the right to consent. Frederick would have lived every day knowing that despite his important role on the plantation, there was very little that he could do to protect his wife and daughters from being raped by Nutt or other white men. Throgmorton also offered insight into the working conditions on Nutt's plantations. Nutt complained that the enslaved laborers did not pick cotton clean enough. This meant he believed they left too much plant matter in the lint, and he told the overseers to drive them, work them harder to force them to pick the cotton cleaner. Exhausted and demoralized, enslaved people on Nutt's plantations began running away. When captured and returned to the plantation, Throgmorton said, "They were whipped so that they had to grease them. Their clothes stuck to them so, and the women were whipped as bad as the men." An enslaved woman, aware of the whereabouts of one of the escaped men, was held over a log heap to torture her to reveal the information. She burned to death. Nutt's letters to his wife, Julia, from Araby Plantation, provide corroborating evidence of his cruelty. Nutt wrote to Julia that the enslaved workers had acted badly, picked badly, been very impudent. 2 months later, in a letter to Julia, he informed her that he had whipped Stephen, Charles, Josh, and Phoebe. Nutt elaborated upon the situation with Phoebe, stating, "I was so provoked with Phoebe about letting the chicken stay in the garden to eat up the celery, and about feeding the dogs, that I could not hold it in. I did give her a royal beating." If Nutt's response to ruined celery was to beat an enslaved woman, one can only imagine what might have befallen Frederick. He held the most important job of any enslaved person on the plantation, with the greatest responsibilities and the weight of the success of the cotton crop upon his shoulders. If the levee did not hold, if the rows were plowed crookedly, if the planting was conducted poorly, it is likely that blame would fall upon Frederick and that consequences might be severe. At times, Nutt seemed to take pleasure in the physical violence he inflicted upon the enslaved community. Haller wrote to Julia, "I was up this morning by daylight and flogged Ede and John Caston before sunrise for doing nothing while I was gone, and I feel much improved from my exercise." Nutt recognized that Araby Plantation was a failing venture. He sold the place in 1850. He turned to his wife's home for his next investment, buying Winter Quarters Plantation from her aunt. Nutt brought his enslaved laborers from Araby Plantation to Winter Quarters. Winter Quarters would be the last plantation upon which Frederick and his family were enslaved. In 1857, Nutt further augmented his holdings by purchasing Evergreen Plantation from his mother-in-law. The sale included land and 96 enslaved people. Much of what has been written about Nutt is mere legend. Many portray him as owning Laurel Hill, Araby, Winter Quarters, and Evergreen simultaneously. This was not the case. He also did not enslave 800 people. At the height of his wealth, his enslaved workforce numbered approximately 261. This should not minimize the fact that he was one of the largest slaveholders in Louisiana and Mississippi, and that he amassed vast wealth through the unpaid and extorted labor of hundreds. Yet even that did not satisfy Nutt. He wanted to be among the wealthiest and most elite of Natchez society, who relied upon their plantations across the river in Louisiana to fund their lavish lifestyle. He began the construction of a grand mansion in Natchez he called Longwood. Today, it is the largest octagonal house in the United States. Frederick's life at Winter Quarters was similar to what he experienced at Araby Plantation, with the exception that Nutt proved less of an absentee owner, at least for several years until the construction of Longwood, where he began living primarily. Lake St. Joseph was the site of 20 large plantations, most owned by the Rouths, Julia's family. 16,000 people were enslaved along the banks of Lake St. Joseph. On the eve of the Civil War, the combined cotton crop of the plantations along Lake St. Joseph was greater than the totals of 30 Louisiana parishes. During this time, Frederick's wife, Maria, disappeared from written records. The most likely explanation is that she died. Mortality rates were high in 19th century Louisiana, especially amongst the enslaved population. Frederick and his wife had had more children, sons named Reuben and Frederick, and a daughter named Nancy. In the fall of 1858, Nutt was absent from Winter Quarters, so his wife, Julia, corresponded with him about the health and well-being of their children. Julia wrote of their 3-year-old son, Prentice, "I never saw such an independent boy for his age. He says he don't want Phoebe to follow after him anymore, but wants a boy. He says Fred will do." Prentice wished not to be looked after by an enslaved woman. Instead, he wanted a boy assigned to watch over him. At the time, there were 2 men with this name on the plantation: Frederick, who would have been around 56, and Fred, his son, who was likely in his early teens. In this era, white people routinely referred to black men as boys, regardless of their age, which is reflected in numerous personal correspondence and bills of sale throughout the South, as well as Nutt's own letters and journal entries. Because of this, Prentice and Julia could have been referring to either of the Freds living at Winter Quarters. The letter does indicate a familiarity with the family, which an enslaved field hand would not have had, emphasizing the importance of Frederick's role. With the coming of the Civil War in 1861, Nutt recognized a threat to the empire he had been intent upon building. When Mississippi and Louisiana seceded from the Union, his elaborate mansion in Natchez remained unfinished. Nutt knew that a war would jeopardize his business interests. He viewed the conflict pragmatically and did not foresee victory for the South. Nutt has been referred to as a Union sympathizer, but it might perhaps be more accurate to say that Nutt was not overtly hostile to the Union Army once it arrived, and took steps to support it in an effort to preserve his fortune. Nutt lamented the loss of New Orleans to Union forces and referred to Union soldiers as the enemy. Fearing Longwood might be destroyed, he would not travel to Winter Quarters. The experiences of Frederick and the enslaved community at winter quarters was fraught with turmoil and danger at this time. Yet it also brought the promise of change, the possibility of freedom. The United States was determined to control the Mississippi River, and Vicksburg proved to be the last Confederate stronghold. General Grant and his soldiers marched through Tensaw Parish and encamped there while awaiting a chance to cross the Mississippi River. Ultimately, the Army crossed at Bruinsburg, which was not far from Laurel Hill Plantation, and surrounded Vicksburg, placing it under siege until Confederate forces finally surrendered on July 4th, 1863. The time between the Union Army's arrival in Tensaw Parish and the surrender of Vicksburg was characterized by great upheaval. Enslaved people at plantations all along Lake St. Joseph chose to leave, either to pursue the Union Army or to stay at neighboring plantations away from their enslavers. While leaving plantations would certainly have provided enslaved people with feelings of autonomy and hope, it also meant they were at risk. The Army was not equipped to provide for a large influx of people with food and shelter, and the enslaved people who sought refuge with the soldiers found that they suffered greatly and lived in conditions rougher even than those on the plantations they had left. Many enslaved people who had chosen to leave the plantations were caught and brought to jail. They were trying to get to the Union fleet at Vicksburg, but were apprehended by paddy rollers, patrols organized by parish governments to police the movements of enslaved people. Union troops engaged enslaved men to perform manual labor. Julia Nutt wrote of enslaved people on a neighboring plantation who cursed their enslavers and threatened them. She wrote, "It is thought that several will be hung, which they deserve." Acts of resistance like this were occurring throughout Tensaw Parish as well as the entire state. Frederick would certainly have been aware they were taking place and may have even witnessed them or taken part. 10 enslaved people from winter quarters fled to a steamboat at the Union encampment. Nutt's overseer was advised to get word to Nutt to either go himself or send someone on his behalf to get the enslaved people and return them to the plantation. When the Confederate cavalry returned to the area, they broke up an encampment at winter quarters and killed several people. The Confederate soldiers informed a large number of the enslaved men that they were considered prisoners, but they left no one to guard them, so many of them fled. Ultimately, many of these enslaved men were taken prisoner when they were found, and 4 of them were hanged. 3 of those hanged had been from winter quarters. A man enslaved by Nutt had been working with the Union Army to form a company of soldiers. It remains unclear if these men had officially enlisted in the United States Colored Infantry, or if they had been in the process of doing so when they were attacked by the Confederate cavalry. So the tumult of war certainly had an impact on Frederick's family. Meanwhile, Haller Nutt was primarily at Longwood in Natchez, making an effort to win over Union officers. He entertained them and did everything he could to convince them of his loyalty and preserve his fortune. He formed alliances with them and used these to his advantage. In April 1863, federal troops moved to Hard Times Landing to cross the river and to begin an assault upon Vicksburg. They met with resistance from Confederate troops in the area, and in response, Union soldiers set fire to many of the homes along Lake St. Joseph and destroyed property. The plantation home at winter quarters was spared, but Nutt suffered significant losses in crops, buildings, and stock. Without enslaved laborers to work his fields, there would be no future cotton crops. Haller Nutt traveled to Vicksburg with an order from the Colonel and General Superintendent of Freedmen in January 1864, permitting him to take from the camps of freedmen his former servants who may wish to return with him to the plantation for the purpose of laboring. Nutt would now be required by law to pay these formerly enslaved workers, now known as freedmen. At last, Frederick and his family would receive compensation for their work, but not at winter quarters. They chose to no longer work for Haller Nutt and were not present on the Freedmen's Bureau contract for winter quarters. Just a few months later, Nutt died, leaving behind a widow and many children in massive debt. The destruction brought on by the war certainly contributed significantly to the financial ruin in which the Nutt family found themselves, yet other key factors emerge: Nutt's lavish lifestyle, the construction of Longwood, and his dependency upon unpaid labor. By the late 1860s, his estate was insolvent, and his widow, sold winter quarters. The family continued to live at Longwood, obsessed with the unfinished palatial home and determined never to sell it. The Nutts decided to sue the federal government for reparations. Their son, Prentice Nutt, moved to Washington, D.C. to supervise and manage the family's claim of $1 million, which would be the equivalent of more than $38 million today. Back in Tensaw Parish, Frederick and his family found work at a plantation owned by the Rouths, the only family members of the Nutts remaining on Lake St. Joseph. They took the surname Baker. In the 1870 census, Frederick Baker, around the age of 70, listed his birthplace as Virginia and his occupation as a farmer. His household consisted of his daughter Nancy, his son Reuben, Reuben's wife Caroline, and his grandchildren Frederick Jr., Millie, and Reuben Jr. Frederick became a minister of Mount Zion, a congregation established in the quarters at John Routh's Hollywood plantation. Between April 1869 and January 1872, he married 69 couples. This is profoundly significant. Enslaved people had been forbidden from entering into legal marriages. As a result, they could be sold apart from their spouses and separated at any time. After emancipation, formerly enslaved people were eager to make their unions legal and official. They recognized the importance of the freedom to be able to marry who they chose and for their unions to be protected and recognized under the law. Frederick was a crucial part in making that happen for the formerly enslaved community along Lake St. Joseph. This also suggests that his Christian faith was instrumental in helping him endure the horrors of slavery. Perhaps most astonishing of all about these marriage certificates is that some were written in Frederick's own hand, revealing that he was literate. Soldiers in the United States Colored Infantry learned to write beside campfires taught by Northern officers. Freedmen's schools were established after the Civil War to educate formerly enslaved people and young children. Yet for someone like Frederick, nearly 70 at the close of the war, these options either would not have been available or not typically something to which someone of his age might have resorted to. Did he learn to write while still enslaved? He was the driver of the plantation, so he held a prominent position. Some well-positioned enslaved people, or those held in high esteem by their enslavers, were taught to read and write, even though it was illegal. Some even managed to surreptitiously teach themselves. Or did Frederick make it a priority to become literate after the Civil War when he was finally free? The question will likely go unanswered. The last marriage Frederick Baker presided over took place on January 30th, 1872. It is quite possible that he died shortly thereafter, or at least became too old and infirm to continue his ministry. He had been a leader among the plantation workers and an esteemed elder in the community. He would have been buried by the congregation of Mount Zion Church on Hollywood Plantation or the adjacent cemetery on Routhland Plantation, another Routh property. Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church, which Frederick helped establish, continued through the late 20th century. Frederick Baker appears to have died sometime in the 1870s, yet he left something behind in addition to his family's cherished memories of his life. Frederick had been the subject of a painting by C.R. Parker. While Frederick's body lay in a grave in Tensas Parish, his face stared out from the walls of Longwood Mansion in Natchez. Likely painted in the 1830s or 1840s at Laurel Hill Plantation, the portrait of Frederick was commissioned by the Nutts. C.R. Parker was a prolific itinerant portrait painter and a friend of the Nutt family. He arrived in New Orleans around 1825 and was commissioned by the Louisiana State Legislature to paint portraits of George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. Parker and another friend of the Nutt family, John James Audubon, were close acquaintances. Parker had a studio in New Orleans, but spent a great deal of time traveling, especially during the summer months when epidemics plagued New Orleans. The New Orleans Bee extolled Parker's work, declaring the characteristics of Mr. Parker's portraits are boldness and fidelity, accuracy of expression, warmth of coloring, and exquisite distribution of light and shade. Why did the Nutts commission C.R. Parker to paint a portrait of a person they considered property? And why, of all the enslaved people on the plantation, did they choose Frederick? At the time he sat for the portrait, Frederick was the highest appraised enslaved person in the Nutts' possession. He held the highest position of an enslaved man on the plantation. It is likely that these factors contributed to the Nutts' decision to have the portrait painted of Frederick. Parker was an itinerant portrait painter in need of work and a family friend, so it is possible that the Nutts considered themselves his patrons. It had been fashionable in Europe to have white sitters pose with black servants or enslaved laborers, but these inclusions of Black people in portraiture were typically characterized by a type, a servile caricature that emphasized the power and prestige of the white sitters. However, the Nutt family did not pose with Frederick, and Parker's rendering of Frederick was that of a complex individual. Much has been made by tour guides, curators, scholars over the attire that Frederick is wearing in the painting, referring it to livery, the like of which was worn by enslaved domestics and carriage drivers, manservants. However, drivers, like Frederick, were known to wear clothing in keeping with their elevated status, including, on occasion, high top leather boots, greatcoats, and top hats. Enslaved people, especially drivers like Frederick, would sometimes be given a large garden plot and they could sell the produce they made. They could also receive a small amount of money for corn crops they harvested. It is documented that this occurred at Laurel Hill. It is well known that enslaved people throughout the South spent some of this money on clothing and enjoyed dressing up when they could. Having possessions like decent clothing provided a sense of pride and autonomy. At a time when photography was in its infancy and the vast majority of people, free or enslaved, did not possess an image of their loved ones, sitting for a portrait was a comparatively rare act. Only the very wealthy were able to engage in such an activity. Thus, the portrait of Frederick is extraordinary, and it acts as a means of bearing witness. Nutt may never have intended to elevate Frederick's status or preserve his memory when he asked Parker to paint him, yet that is exactly the result of his action. For Nutt, Frederick's portrait would have conveyed the image of a loyal and subservient subject, but for modern viewers, it provides a compelling reminder of the events of the past and destroys the anonymity and dehumanizing elements of slavery. Frederick stands before us in his portrait as a human being, reminding us that the brutal system of chattel slavery and the white supremacist caste system that has been upheld even after its dissolution impacted actual people. Although he was an enslaved man, he was also a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a skilled and intelligent survivor. While custom and finances dictated that portraiture should be dominated by white and wealthy individuals, the humanizing element of a portrait remains another key factor in plantation owners typically refraining from having the images of the people they enslaved captured in paintings or later in photographs. It is important to note that Frederick's feelings about having his likeness captured will always be unknown. How voluntary was this action? Was he coerced, or did he willingly participate? Or, as so often is the case, was it likely somewhere in between those two possibilities? For an enslaved man like Frederick, the autonomy captured truly was an illusion. Only wealthy plantation owners, merchants, and the landed gentry of Europe were the subject of large oil paintings. Nutt and his family occupied the mansion in which Frederick's portrait was displayed, while Frederick and his family labored in the fields. According to the laws of Louisiana and Mississippi, Frederick's body was the possession of Hal or Nutt. Now, through the possession of the painting, Nutt had another means of objectifying Frederick. Frederick Baker's family never owned a painting that allowed them to remember their father and grandfather, even after they were free. The people who had owned Frederick while he was alive owned his likeness after his death. In 1884, Prentice Nutt was still in Washington lobbying on his family's behalf. Plans were in the making for an exposition to be held in New Orleans. It would showcase the art, industry, manufacturing, and agriculture of every state. Akin to a World's Fair, the event was commonly referred to as the New Orleans Cotton Exposition or the 1884 Exposition, and it was designed in large part to commemorate a century of cotton being exported from New Orleans. Through the connections he had forged, Prentice was appointed Commissioner of the State of Pennsylvania's contribution to the exposition, and it was in this capacity that he met former Senator Bruce K. Blanche, in Philadelphia. Blanche was the first black senator to serve a full term, and he represented Mississippi. Blanche was named the commissioner of the Colored People's Department for the exposition and was visiting the state to encourage support of and contributions toward the exposition. Prentice Nutt wrote home to his mother at Longwood to box up the portraits of Routh ancestors, Hal or Nutt, and old Frederick to send to New Orleans for the exposition. Old Frederick's portrait I have promised to loan ex-Senator Bruce for the Colored People's exhibit, he noted, adding that he wanted the picture of winter quarters to also be sent. The Colored People's exhibition consisted of 34,000 square feet and 16,000 exhibits, filled with contributions from northern states like New York and Pennsylvania, as well as states in the Deep South like Louisiana and Mississippi. White Southern businessmen saw it as an opportunity to highlight the economic recovery of the South after the Civil War, promoting a new South economy while still maintaining the white supremacy of the Old South. Black leaders like former Senator Bruce believed it was a chance to showcase the achievements of Black Americans, stressing their intellectual and artistic capabilities and the immense gains that had been made since freedom. The separation of Black citizens from their state exhibits anticipated the legalized segregation that would emerge in the 1890s with the passage of Jim Crow laws and the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson. Frederick's portrait was not included in the Louisiana and Mississippi exhibits, the states in which he had resided. Instead, Prentice Nutt and men like him ensured that the racial hierarchy of the nation was strictly enforced. Frederick Baker's identity as a citizen was limited because of the color of his skin and his status as a formerly enslaved man. And the exhibiting of his portrait reflected that. Upon the conclusion of the Cotton Centennial, the painting was packed up and returned to Longwood. It remained in Natchez until December 2024. Frederick Baker's son, Frederick Jr., remained in Tensaw Parish, as did his daughter, Nancy. The Bakers witnessed great violence and significant racial tensions. Between 1877 and 1950, 29 Black people were lynched in Tensaw Parish, making it among the 4 parishes in Louisiana with the highest number of lynchings. When Frederick lived there in 1860, 90% of the population of Tensaw Parish was enslaved. 90%. The parish remains a majority Black one today, and due to limited economic opportunities, it is the least populated parish in the state. Between 1870 and 1880, Frederick Baker's son Reuben died. His widow Caroline remarried, and she and her new husband brought Frederick's grandchildren with them to Gregg County in East Texas, where they sought greater economic opportunities. Reuben Baker Jr. became a teacher and later moved to Muskogee County, Oklahoma. His grave is in Taft Cemetery beside his wife and 4 children. Frederick Baker's grandson, Frederick, and his namesake, lived with his wife and children in Delta County, Texas. His youngest son, Caudilla, graduated from NYU in 1936 with a degree in business administration. Caudilla Baker was a veteran of World War II and ultimately settled in Rochester, New York. Over his long career, he managed housing projects, was an auditor with the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and worked for the IRS. He served as vice president of the Rochester Association for the United Nations. The financial system he devised for UNICEF made Rochester's branch one of the best in the country. Caudilla Baker said, "There's nothing more important than good housing. No matter where a child is born, if he gets a chance to grow up in a good home, that's what he'll want for his own children later." One can imagine that his great-grandfather Frederick Baker Sr. longed for good housing as he was forced to raise his children in the slave quarters. There is an oral history program sponsored by the Rochester Public Library, and they interviewed Mr. Caudilla Baker prior to his death. You can go online and hear his voice, Frederick's great-grandson's voice, as he tells the story of his life. He speaks of his father and his father's passion for education, his strong faith, and his desire that all his children attend college. And he was able to send all of his children to college except for Caudilla, because by that point the nation had entered the Great Depression. But, as we know, Caudilla Baker did eventually find his way up to NYU and graduated and went on to have a storied and praiseworthy career. Caudilla's father, who so valued faith and education, was born and raised in the same household as his namesake, his grandfather, Frederick Baker Sr. So, given Frederick's role as a minister and the fact that he was literate, it's clear he passed those values down to his sons and grandchildren. When Caudilla Baker and his wife bought a home in an all-white neighborhood, he was forced to file a lawsuit to gain possession of the house due to white residents trying to drive him out. He found support in a Protestant minister, the local rabbi, and the Reynas, one of the families in his new neighborhood. One of his most precious mementos was an essay written by Joanne Reyna for her high school class. I'd like to close with her words, which were cherished by Frederick Baker's great-grandson. The Bakers turned my ideals from just a hazy, uncertain picture into a clear-cut image of seeing the true person. Prejudice runs deep and short through our nation, and because of this, our linking chain will always be weak. But if people would only take the time to look a little farther into the hearts of all men, much of this prejudice would disappear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katy. It's very powerful words there. Hope you all enjoyed the evening. We can't thank you enough for the research that she has done and so beautifully presented tonight. And I would like to, we have a great audience in the room. So for those of you watching online, feel free to email us if you have any questions or comments, and we will absolutely try to address those. But if not, I'd love to open the floor here in the room. If anyone would like to ask any questions, please let us know. Absolutely.
Did Parker paint any of the nut or root family members?
So I can answer that. Not that we have found, no. The portraits that you saw on the screen of the Nutt family were done by Justin Sandcan a few years prior to the Parker portrait. So Parker didn't leave a large body of work for us to study, but what we did find was pretty interesting, and certainly enough to support this long-held attribution. It is unsigned, which is why it has long been attributed. But he frequently did not sign his paintings. It has been attributed as far back as history as we could find, essentially. So I'm not sure where it began, but I do believe, based on our research, that it is an accurate attribution. Yes, absolutely.
This is probably never going to be known, but I'm so curious to know why he chose Baker as a surname. If there were Bakers in the Natchez area, or it's interesting that he didn't take the name of someone, maybe he did take the name of someone close to him. Does anyone know?
We can't say definitively, but I've been doing this 20 years now, and one of the patterns that I've seen here in Louisiana, in the Creole area of Louisiana, is people taking their father's first name as their surname. However, in this case, if you see that Frederick went back to Virginia, his origins were in Virginia. There had been an enslaved community in Virginia for many generations at that point, and many of them, most of them, had surnames, whether they were documented or not. And so it is likely that it was the name of his father's surname, or someone close that was associated with him, would be what I would say based on everything that I've seen.
Couple things. Is it possible that there was an actual baker in the family or someone close to them, and they had chosen that last name based on someone actually being a baker?
That's not impossible.
And the other question is on the fact that Parker suggested painting Frederick.
Could be.
I'm afraid that's part of the mystery I doubt we'll ever solve.
Right.
Is why exactly this object exists and why Frederick was chosen to sit for it. So there were a number of them, and there is one known example. Unfortunately, the image itself has been lost of a portrait done of a driver that would have been Homer Ryan on Maidwood Plantation
in Louisiana.
by Jacquemus, and we know that portrait existed. Unfortunately, we don't know what it looked like. So
what was his wife's duty at the plantation?
We don't know that. It wasn't specified.
it's possible indeed. Yes, Lydia.
It's really interesting thinking of the portrait of Delia, which is at the Mississippi Museum of Art now, which also had descended in a Natchez family and hung in that family's home until very recently.
Absolutely, and in which case the artist was also friends with the family, much like it was happened here. Yeah, and it's a beautiful portrait. I encourage everyone to look at that one as well. You know, really the only two that we have.
Of individual sitters,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. And that is, again, Portrait of Delia at the Mississippi Museum of Art. You can Google it. It's a beautiful painting. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
It appears Mr. Nutt might have been a somewhat Jekyll and Hyde character. How do you reconcile the treatment that he was sometimes perhaps became expression is that just happenstance and that's descending as a part of a myth that you allude to, or because obviously you have records of him being pretty badly treated to enslaved.
I don't know that I would say he was a Jekyll and Hyde. I think that most of the written evidence that comes from people who actually experienced slavery on his plantations and in the area would confirm that he was cruel. I would also add that I don't think he was an aberration. I think that this was typical of plantations. I think that slavery necessitated violence and brutality. You cannot hold people in slavery without engaging in brutality and violence. And we are just, as sadly, as horrible as it is to read these things, it's also fortunate that there is a written record, that these documents are extant, that show what happened on these plantations that Nutt owned. Unfortunately, so many of them are not existent for many of the other plantations, but I would say that this is likely, based on everything that I've seen in 20 years, this was typically what went on, and he was a typical slaveholder of that time.
I do agree with what you're saying. You do allude early on in your thesis
Mm-hmm.
that he speaks, unless I misunderstood.
Well, these were his property. He wanted, sure, he wanted to protect his property, so didn't want his overseer necessarily to do things that would endanger their health or well-being. But if they did something he believed merited a flogging or violence, there were times when the sacrifice of an individual, even death, was necessary in order to make a point to the rest of the enslaved community. So while he was looking into their medical care and trying to keep them healthy in order to ensure he had a labor force, that benefited him as much as it might them, if that makes sense. Okay.
Yes.
Katy, how important do you think it is, not, and this question is not just about Frederick, but more so about the history and the importance here. How important is it, do you think, to give this a voice, to do this research, to educate people on him and who he was and who Nutt was? Because
When I started this work 20 years ago, it really wasn't something that people were doing. Um, but I felt very strongly that there were stories that were going untold, and I was a strange child obsessed with history who forced my parents to take me to historic sites, and I knew that what I was hearing was one-sided. And you cannot go to a historic site and only hear one side of the story, particularly a place that was built by a population that was enslaved. And when you go to a plantation and only hear the story of the people who inhabited the big house, you're actually not hearing the story of the majority of the people who lived on the place. So it's really a farce to go to a place and be told you're hearing history and that you're hearing the truth if really only one element of the narrative is being told, if primary sources aren't being involved. And there is truth. Truth is found through primary sources and through in-depth research, and it's imperative now more than ever, as our history is increasingly being threatened with whitewashing and with erasure, that we stand up and have the courage to tell these stories even when things are being threatened. And I applaud Neal for seeing the importance of this painting and doing right by Frederick, and seeing that his memory was honored and cherished.
And I'd just like to say that's because of Katy that all of this happened. So thank
It's
you
not
so
just
much for
me,
the work.
it's because Neal
work-
Auction saw the value.
And for the work that you do, not just on this portrait, but on all the work that you do. We really value that. And I think we have a question on the front row.
Katy, thank you for your work. We really appreciate it. What you revealed to us about Frederick is very good.
Yeah.
And thanks for Marnie, and just a pleasure working with the auction. So my question probably would be another symposium, but in dealing with tourism and showing the homes that we do in Natchez, it's a constant battle to make a balance of how to deal with slavery and enslaved. And our chief function at Coverage Garden Club is to restore and renovate these beautiful mansions. And so part of that is showing them, and also the decor, which would include Frederick portraits. But the situation deals with everyone's human. Some people have an easier manner with the subject than others. Some want to totally avoid it. So we're constantly dealing with that. However, the other issue that becomes very much that I'm concerned about is that when it's brought up, we will often have someone in the audience who becomes very antagonistic and goes off. We can spend half our tour discussing the merits or non-merits of slavery. So how do you suggest that in a short time, a tour guide or somebody dealing with this would give the treatment, the balanced treatment as you're referring to, finding out the other occupants of the house? What would you say?
I would say I wouldn't engage in a debate with anyone over the merits of slavery. I wouldn't. And I would say that you can go to Laura Plantation and take an outstanding tour where you'll hear about both the people who occupied the big house and their importance, as well as the enslaved people who occupied both the big house and the quarters. And go and look for models of where it's being done, how it's being done. And I recognize that it's a difficult subject, but it can't be avoided just because it's difficult. It needs to be difficult. It should be difficult.
And I would say Longwood has, and you guys, people in Natchez have, this painting survives.
That's right.
Because the people of Natchez have kept it safe this long. And we certainly hope it is for decades to come in the place where scholarship can continue. But Longwood has a unique opportunity because this painting was there, and because Frederick's story is tied. You have a unique opportunity to have a face and a human element through this painting that other places don't have. I mean, this is, again, such a rare object. And Frederick's story, I think Katy said to me, it felt like it was all the primary records were just there waiting for her. And that is it feels like kismet somehow, because that doesn't happen.
No, it
So many
doesn't.
people were lost, their stories, their faces, and through this portrait and her work, this is an important story to share, not just for Frederick Baker, but for all of those others as well. And Longwood is right at the center. So, yeah. Yeah. And now we do. Yeah, and that is the great thing about scholarship, right, is that it's always continuing. So, I bet there will be even more. If we had given her more than 2 months, I think there could have been a whole book. I think I saw another hand there in the back. Yes, sir.
How many years has it been in Longwood?
Since the late 1860s.
Why is it being sold?
So the portrait's value has certainly been recognized historically, but recent years it's been recognized monetarily as well. And if you've been to Longwood, you know it's fairly isolated, and it's a tough spot to keep something like this safe and insured. And I think the Pilgrimage Garden Club of Natchez recognizes also that this story needs to be told on a much wider scale, that it needs to reach a very broad audience. And its story will always be a part of Longwood, but the painting itself, I think, can be a powerful moment in a much wider, bigger institution with a national audience. And we hope it goes on to do that. And the funds are going back to the Pilgrimage Garden Club just to maintain the historic properties themselves.
Because
So,
historic properties are very difficult to maintain. They
Absolutely.
are, and so I applaud everyone who's doing the work in historic
Yeah.
preservation to keep
Yeah.
those properties thriving.
And I think the docents at Longwood have a big challenge ahead of them, but I know if any crew is up to it, it's them. Absolutely. Yes.
So this portrait stays in the family. So I'm sure there was a lot of lore around it. And I was wondering, was any of it accurate? I mean, what you've come up with is original documentation, primary sources.
Yes.
But I'm sure there was all kinds of family lore
So much.
about it. So did it match up?
What I have found, and what I believe, is that a lot of the lore first appeared when Prentice Nutt was organizing his contribution to the 1884 exposition, and that involved saying that Haller Nutt owned multiple plantations at once and owned 800 slaves. He had a write-up about it. So I think that originated some of the grandiose ideas about Nutt. As far as the lore about Frederick, I am not sure that it dates from the family or actually from the acquisition of the house once it became a tourist attraction, and that I think there were suppositions made based upon the painting of who might be the type of person who would be painted, a house servant, that kind of person, and they were making some suppositions based upon the appearance of the painting without engaging in research. And so, no, it did not match up, but that's the evolving nature of history.
The name
The
remained.
name. The name.
The name remained.
Yes, the name remained.
And I
Thank
think
you,
a
Marnie.
lot of the lore was, sort of based on word of mouth, and then it would get exaggerated. It would just sort of piled onto itself. I mean, it's been happening for 150
Right.
years. So, yes.
We do have our president of our garden club actually lived at home. Her aunt was married to one of the grandchildren.
Yeah.
And she will tell you, as others, that yes, he was referred to by his uncle Frederick, and he had been a valet of Holler. Now, whether that's myth, but my question is, the painting itself says a lot, because in Arabella Plantation, or at Laurel Hill, I don't think that Holler would have said, "Oh, go get me a slave, and we'll put this fine coat on him and take pictures." They do a portrait. I think there was much more to it. I think the family lore, that he was a very special member of the family, is very important.
He wasn't a member of the family.
Well, he was not a member of the family.
He was certainly important to
But
the family.
yes.
Yes. And, I work in an auction house, right? So we know about family lore around here. Lots of objects have a lot of family lore that's, truth or not. We tend to
Right.
uncover things in this capacity.
Did you ever
Yes.
find photographs of them later on?
No.
No, unfortunately not. Yes. So we mentioned the portrait of Delia would be the other portrait of an enslaved individual pre-emancipation in the South. And that portrait, again, individual portrait like this, and it is at the Mississippi Museum of Art, also with ties to Natchez. So fascinating. Yes.
If I may say one more thing, I'm remembering that you said that Nutt wanted to portray himself as a wealthy, elite nabob of the Natchez communities, and the building of Longwood, this magnificent, giant place, is part of that. And I think that having a unique portrait, a large portrait painted of an enslaved person, is another way of sort of performing class.
Yes.
And so having a portrait, a painted portrait, is one element of class. But then the subject of the portrait is an enslaved person wearing what looks like the garb of maybe a house servant, even though you've proven that he
Sure.
wasn't. For me, it's all about a performance of class. Whether or not someone consciously said, this is why we're going to do this, that's what it represents to me, alongside the photographs of formerly enslaved people and the children that they cared for. If you put that framed in your house, it says to people, I had the money to make a photograph made, but I also had the money to own the person in the photograph.
That's great insight.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
What is the earliest known reference to this painting being named Frederick?
1884.
1884.
The letter Prentice Nutt wrote about the exposition, sending the paintings. So in 1884. Yes.
Yeah. Which I will point out is the last time this portrait was on view publicly in New Orleans, which is till now.
Question I was going to ask, because you mentioned painting disappear in the appropriate exhibition. Imagine it wasn't shown.
Well, it was shown in the Colored People's Exposition, but there was controversy surrounding the entire Cotton Centennial Exposition because each state had their own exhibit, and then there was one just designated for colored people. So it showed the segregation and the white supremacist caste system of the time and what would become institutionalized, legalized segregation in the 1890s. It was included, yes. Oh, yeah.
Which would have been right down the road in
That's
what is
right.
now Audubon Park.
That's right.
And it was mostly like crafts that.
There was all kinds of things. There was portraiture. There was a model steamboat. All kinds of things. Yep, crafts and things.
All right. Any final questions before we close for the evening? And again, want to thank you all for joining us, and those of you online as well. And
Thank
Katy,
you.
can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Again, thank you.